Imagine threatening to leave NATO. Not because of nuclear missiles, not because of an invasion, not because of some grand ideological betrayal, because of fish. In the cold waters of the North Atlantic, one of the strangest and most consequential conflicts of the 20th century played out between two allies, two democracies, two friends. On one side, the United Kingdom, a global empire still clinging to its former greatness. On the other, Iceland, a volcanic island of barely 200,000 people with no army, no air force, and almost no navy. And Iceland won. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. This is the story of the Cod Wars, a conflict that was never officially a war, never officially a crisis, and yet nearly shattered the Western Alliance at the height of the Cold War. It's a story about survival, sovereignty, and the terrifying power of knowing exactly what you have and exactly how far you're willing to go to protect it. The island that had nothing else. To understand why Iceland fought so hard, you have to understand what Iceland was. There were no great rivers of oil beneath its surface, no vast forests, no fertile plains stretching to the horizon. What Iceland had was the sea, and in the sea it had cod. For centuries, cod wasn't just food, it was currency. It was survival. It was the reason Icelandic civilization existed at all on that remote, windswept rock in the North Atlantic. The fishing industry wasn't one part of Iceland's economy, it was the economy. At its peak, fish accounted for more than 90% of the country's export earnings. Without fish, there was no Iceland. It was that simple. And for centuries, fishermen from across Europe understood this too. The waters around Iceland were among the richest fishing grounds on the planet, cold, deep, and teeming with cod. British trawlers had been working those waters for generations, so had Germans, so had Belgians. The sea, as far as most of the world was concerned, was open. International law at the time gave coastal nations control of only 3 nautical miles of ocean, a limit set not by science, not by ecology, but by the range of an 18th century canon. Iceland accepted this until the fish started disappearing, drawing a line in the water. By the 1950s, Icelandic scientists were raising alarms. The cod stocks were being hammered. Hundreds of foreign trawlers were dragging their nets through Icelandic waters year-round, and the catches were beginning to shrink. If nothing changed, the industry, and with it the country, would collapse. So in 1958, Iceland made a decision that shocked the world. It extended its fishing limit from 3 nautical miles to 12. It sounds modest, it sounds reasonable. By modern standards, it barely registers. But at the time, it was treated like an act of war. Britain refused to recognize the new boundary. The Royal Navy was dispatched to escort British trawlers inside the 12-mile limit. Iceland had no navy to speak of, just a small coast guard with a handful of lightly armed patrol vessels. But they showed up anyway. And in those frigid, churning waters, British warships and Icelandic Coast Guard ships began a strange, slow-motion confrontation, circling each other, blocking each other, occasionally colliding. This was the first Cod War, and it ended eventually in compromise, with Britain grudgingly accepting a version of the 12-mile limit. Iceland had won the first round, but the fish were still disappearing. Escalation. The world begins to watch. A decade passed, the catches kept falling, and Iceland reached the same conclusion it had reached before. The only solution was more ocean. In 1972, Iceland extended its limit again, this time to 50 nautical miles. Britain erupted. This wasn't just about fish anymore. This was about precedent. If Iceland could unilaterally redraw the boundaries of international waters, what would stop every coastal nation on Earth from doing the same? The entire framework of maritime law, which allowed British trawlers to operate across the globe, was suddenly under threat. The Second Cod War began, and this time it was uglier. Icelandic Coast Guard vessels began deploying a weapon that was almost absurdly unglamorous: wire cutters. Long cables dragged through the water to sever the trawl wires of British fishing boats, leaving them drifting and helpless, their nets lost to the deep. The British responded with their own ships, their own tactics, and once again the Royal Navy arrived to protect its trawlers. There were collisions, there were standoffs, there were moments when a single miscalculation could have turned a maritime dispute into something far more serious. But Iceland had a weapon far more powerful than wire cutters. It had leverage. At the height of the Cold War, Iceland hosted Keflavik Air Base, one of the most strategically critical NATO installations in the world. Sitting in the middle of the North Atlantic, it was the key surveillance and patrol hub for monitoring Soviet submarine movements between the Atlantic and the Arctic. Without Iceland, NATO's entire northern flank was exposed. Iceland knew this, and Iceland was not afraid to say it out loud. Reykjavik began floating the idea, quietly at first, then less quietly, of withdrawing from NATO entirely if Britain didn't back down, of inviting the Soviets in perhaps, of becoming neutral. The threats were almost certainly bluffs, but almost certainly wasn't good enough. Washington began to panic, NATO began to panic, and Britain, under enormous pressure from its allies, backed down again. Iceland had won the second round. The final war, when a nation went all in. By 1975, Iceland had decided that 50 miles wasn't enough either. It extended its limit to 200 nautical miles, a boundary so vast it encompassed virtually the entire productive fishing ground around the island. This wasn't a negotiating position. This was a final answer. The Third Cod Wars was the most intense of all. British trawlers, now fighting for their economic survival, pushed back harder than ever. The Royal Navy returned in force. Icelandic Coast Guard vessels, outgunned, outmanned, but operating in home waters, played a desperate, relentless game of cat and mouse. More wires were cut, more collisions occurred. One Icelandic vessel, the Thor, became something of a national symbol. A tiny ship facing down warships many times its size, again and again, without flinching. The confrontations grew so dangerous that both governments formally protested each other's behavior at the United Nations. Iceland briefly recalled its ambassador from London, the closest thing to a diplomatic rupture short of severing relations entirely. And then Iceland played its final card. Reykjavik announced it was seriously considering withdrawing from NATO. Not hinting, not suggesting, announcing. The Prime Minister said it plainly. If Britain did not recognize Iceland's 200-mile limit, Iceland would reassess its entire relationship with the Western Alliance. The timing was exquisite. The mid-1970s were perhaps the most anxious years of the Cold War. Soviet naval power was at its peak. The Atlantic sea lanes, the routes along which American troops and supplies would flow to Europe in the event of war, ran directly past Iceland. Keflavik wasn't just strategically important, it was arguably irreplaceable. NATO's Secretary General flew to Reykjavik personally to mediate. The Americans leaned on London with a pressure that left no room for ambiguity. And Britain, the United Kingdom, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a nuclear power, a nation with one of the most powerful navies in history, capitulated to an island with no army. In 1976, Britain formally accepted Iceland's 200-mile fishing exclusion zone. British trawlers were banned from Icelandic waters entirely. The Cod Wars were over. Iceland had won, completely and utterly. The price of victory. The consequences rippled outward in ways no one had fully anticipated. For the British fishing industry, the defeat was catastrophic. Ports like Hull and Grimsby, entire communities built around the North Atlantic cod trade, collapsed almost overnight. Thousands of fishermen lost their livelihoods. The trawler fleets were broken up and sold for scrap. Within a generation, places that had sent ships to Icelandic waters for centuries were reduced to post-industrial shadows of themselves. Fish and chips, Britain's most iconic dish, the meal that had fed the working class for over a century, suddenly became expensive. The cheap, abundant cod that had always filled those newspaper-wrapped parcels was gone. Prices rose, portions shrank, some shops closed. The cultural wound was quietly profound. But Iceland's victory did something far larger than reshape one nation's fishing industry. It changed international law. Inspired by Iceland's success, coastal nations around the world began pushing for 200-mile exclusive economic zones of their own. The concept, which Iceland had essentially invented through sheer political will, became the foundation of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, adopted in 1982. Today, 200-mile EEZs govern the oceans of the entire world. Every coastal nation, from the United States to Nigeria to Australia, controls its waters under a framework that traces its origins, in large part, to a tiny island's fight over cod. Iceland had not just won a fishing dispute, it had rewritten the rules of the ocean. What the fish left behind. There is a painful irony buried in Iceland's triumph. The 200-mile limit was supposed to save the cod, and in Icelandic waters, managed carefully, it eventually helped stabilize stocks. But across the North Atlantic, the story was darker. The cod that had seemed inexhaustible, the fish that had fed Europe for 5 centuries, that had launched the colonization of North America, that had built empires, were in serious trouble. The Grand Banks off Newfoundland, once the richest fishing ground in the world, were so severely overfished that in 1992, Canada imposed a total moratorium on cod fishing. It was supposed to be temporary. The cod were supposed to recover. Decades later, they still haven't. Not fully, not in the way anyone hoped. The ocean, it turned out, had limits. It just took humanity a very long time to believe it. Iceland today remains one of the world's most prosperous nations. Its economy diversified, aluminum smelting, geothermal energy, tourism, finance. But fishing is still central. The sea is still what Iceland is. The Coast Guard vessels that once faced down the Royal Navy are still out there, patrolling those 200 miles of hard-won ocean. And in the old fishing towns of northern England, the memory of the Cod Wars still stings, not as a geopolitical lesson, but as a personal one. Fathers who were fishermen, grandfathers who were fishermen, a way of life erased. In the end, the Cod Wars weren't really about fish. They were about who gets to decide, who controls the resources that make survival possible, whether size and power automatically trump justice and necessity, and whether a small nation with nothing but clarity of purpose and an understanding of its own indispensability can face down a giant and win. Iceland proved that the answer is yes. Under the right circumstances, with the right leverage, even the smallest country can force the most powerful ones to blink. But here is the question that lingers, the one that the cold water and the empty nets and the ghost towns of northern England quietly ask. When a nation fights so hard to protect a resource and wins, who is responsible for making sure that resource actually survives?